Okay guys, today we are going to talk about simplifying fractions. Now when you simplify a fraction, it's just like finding an equivalent form of that fraction, just in a smaller version. You've seen a brief preview of this in your comparing fractions video, so let's go over it again. If I have a fraction like 6/8 and I need to simplify it, I need to find the greatest common factor between 6 and 8. So you have two options. One, if you know your facts really well, it's really easy to identify the largest number that will go into both of them. If you don't know your facts really well, you use your t-charts. So for 6, we know we have 1 and 6, 2 and 3, and the table repeats after 3, so we stop. Then for 8, I have 1 and 8, 2 and 4, 3 and nothing, and then the table repeats at 4, so we stop again. So there are all of our factors of 6 and our factors of 8. And if we were finding the greatest common factor, we would notice that it is 2. So I put my divide, because that's how we simplify a fraction, we divide it down, and I'm using 2 as my greatest common factor. So I know that 2 goes into 6 3 times, it's over here on my table as well, and I know that 2 goes into 8 4 times, it's over here in my table as well. So when I simplify the fraction 6/8, it is simplified down into 3/4. That is its simplest form. Now, how do you know if you can simplify a fraction? Because sometimes you may see a fraction and you may not be sure if it can be simplified or not. Well, there are 5 rules, and I got these 5 rules from the junior high, so you will be seeing them again next year. But there are 5 rules that you can use to determine whether or not a fraction is simplified. Rule number 1 is called OOT, O-O-T, and that means if there is a 1 on top. So if I have a fraction like 1/12, I know that it is already simplified because it matches the OOT rule. It has a 1 on top, so there's no way for me to simplify it any further. My second rule is my CO rule, and CO stands for counting order. Now you're in 5th grade, so hopefully all of you know how to count, but if your fraction is written in counting order, then it's already simplified. For example, 2/3 is written in counting order because when you count, 2 comes before 3. 8/9 is written in counting order. 11/12, 17/18. All of those fractions are written in counting order, which means that there is no way for you to simplify them because they are already simplified. Our third rule is the BP rule. BP means they are both prime. So let's try 7/11. We know that 7/11 cannot be simplified because 7 is prime and 11 is prime. So obviously that follows the BP rule, so it cannot be simplified. Our fourth rule is the TP divided by B, and that means if the top is prime and it won't divide into the bottom. So that means if, for example, 3 is prime, but let's say 20 is not prime. So my TP divided by B means that if this top is prime, I got to see if it'll divide into the bottom. That's the only thing I can do with it. So can 3 go into 20? No, it can't. So I know that automatically this fraction is simplified. There's no other way for me to simplify it. And our final rule is the rule that all of you we've been using for a while, and that's just finding the GCF. And if my GCF equals 1, then obviously that means that that fraction cannot be simplified. For example, if I have the fraction 4/9, okay, I do my table for 4, I do my table for 9, 1 and 4, 2 and 2, then my table is repeated, so I stop. 1 and 9, 2 and nothing, 3 and 3, my table repeats, so I stop. So when I'm looking for common factors, my only common factor is 1, so if my greatest common factor is 1, that fraction cannot be simplified. So those are the 5 rules that you use: the OOT, the CO, the BP, the TP divided by B, and the GCF equals 1. And if it doesn't fit any of those rules, then you know that it can be simplified somehow. So when you are doing fraction work in class and you are having to prove whether or not a fraction can be simplified, you're going to have to identify what rule it fits to show me that it can't be or it can be simplified. For example, let's say I tell you to simplify the fraction 2/9. And you're trying to simplify it. Well, it doesn't match the OOT rule because the OOT rule means a 1 on top, so it doesn't match that rule. Let's look at another rule. The other rule was CO. Is it in counting order? 2, 3. No, it's not. Are they both prime? Well, 2 is prime, but 9 is not, so I can't use that rule. Is the top prime, and can it divide? And it won't divide the bottom. Okay, my top is prime, and it won't divide the bottom, so that means that this is already simplified. So I know that it's already simplified because it matches the top prime divided by the bottom. And that's all I have to write to show that it's already simplified. If I were to take a fraction and you were told to simplify something like, let's do 10/80ths. Now many of you right away would be able to identify that that can be simplified by using the greatest common factor. So we would use our rules. No, it's not in counting order. They're not both prime. The top's not prime. What were some of the other ones? Let's see. There's not a 1 on top. And the only other rule we have to check is the greatest common factor. So I make my t-chart for 10, and I make my t-chart for 80. 10 is 1 and 10, 2 and 5, 3 and nothing, 4 and nothing, and we stop at 5 because the table repeats. 80 is 1 and 80, 2 and 40, 3 and nothing, 4 and 20, 5 and I'm not thinking right now, so I'm going to just divide it off to the side. 16, 5 and 16. 6 does not go into it, neither does 7. 8 does 10 times, and then 9 doesn't, and then we stop at 10 because 10 repeats. So I have to find the greatest common factor now. Now I see that they have a common factor of 1. I see they have a common factor of 2. I see they have a common factor of 10 and a common factor of 5. So they have a lot of common factors. So when I simplify this, I have to use the greatest. So let me erase this division work. And our greatest common factor is 10. So I'm going to use 10 as my greatest common factor. So 10 will go into 10 one time. 10 will go into 80 8 times. Now, before I can just say that's the answer, I have to make sure that that answer is in simplest form. And I use those 5 rules to determine whether or not it's in simplest form. And the first rule on that list that tells me these fractions are in simplest form is my OOT rule, 1 on top. Well, if I look at this simplified fraction, I see that there is a 1 on top, so I know that this fraction is in simplest form, and that is my answer. The reason we use those rules is because sometimes with a fraction like 10/80ths, people will choose a common factor that's not necessarily the greatest. Like somebody may have not noticed that 10 was on both lists, so they may have chose to use 5 instead. And 5 goes into 10 twice, 5 goes into 80 16 times. And they would have said, oh, 2/16, that's my simplified answer. Well, you did simplify, but you didn't simplify it all the way. So that would not even have been an answer choice on anything because it's not completely simplified. And because you didn't choose the greatest common factor, you just chose a common factor, you're going to have to do the work all over again. Now we'd have to find the GCF for 2 and 16. Because if I used my simplification rules, the 5 rules that were on this other page, I would notice that, oh, this fraction doesn't fit any of those rules. Since it doesn't fit any of those rules, I am going to have to simplify it again. And I would see that, oh, 2's my common factor. 2 goes into 2 once. 2 goes into 16/8. Now I have 1 as the numerator, so now I can use that as my simplified fraction. So you see the reason of finding the greatest common factor is the fact that there's a lot less work when you do the greatest common factor. When you're not, you may have to simplify 2, 3, 4 times, and you're ending up doing double, triple, and quadruple the work. So make sure you use your 5 simplification rules to see if the fraction is already simplified. Remember, the first rule is oot. If there's a 1 on top, it's already simplified. Number 2 is counting order. If the fraction is in counting order, like 2/3, 8/9, 11/12, it's already simplified. Number 3 is BP, where they're both prime. If the numerator and the denominator are prime, it's already simplified. Number 4, if the top is prime and it won't divide the bottom, then you know that that is simplified as well. And the final one is the greatest common factor. If the greatest common factor between those two numbers, the numerator and the denominator, are 1, then you know your fraction is already simplified. So you're going to have to use these rules, and if when you simplify a fraction, you are going to have to tell me how you know it's simplified. So this 1/8 would not have been a complete answer. I would need to write oot, because I know that there is a 1 on top. So I know now that it's simplified, and I've proved it by finding the rule that matches it.